Hey folks, David Wills here with another episode of TED-IELTS, and today we're going to be looking at process diagrams. You can see on the screen here we have a process diagram about how to make cement and concrete. This is a diagram that I've seen cause problems for some students. I've taught this with my classes in China a few times, and I've also worked on this with some people who use my writing correction service. There are some difficulties in doing this process diagram, and today I'd like to talk to you about them and show you how to write a very effective description of this. So let's jump right in. You can see here that there are two pictures. On the left it says cement production, and on the right it says concrete production. So if we look at part number 1 then, we can see this process. It follows this path downwards, and at the bottom there is cement. If we look then at number 2, it is a little different, and we can't really see any sort of outcome here, but we know that it is concrete production, so the end product must be concrete. In order to write a good description for IELTS Writing Task 1, we need to structure our essay. And so in this case, I think it's quite clear we have two parts to describe. So part 1 is going to be cement, and part 2 is going to be concrete. Now, before we do that, we're going to have to write an introduction, of course, and our introduction is going to have to say what this is. So is this a line graph, a bar chart, a map? No. As I said, we state that this is a process diagram. We can state that this has two parts to it, and we can state that part 1 describes cement and part 2 describes concrete production. Is there anything else we need to state in our introduction? As you probably know, when we're describing line graphs and other things for IELTS Writing Task 1, we do need to describe a general trend. Is there a general trend here? Not exactly. But if we look part 1, making cement, cement is the outcome here, and cement is an ingredient or component of the concrete production in part 2. So I think it would be useful to mention in our introduction that part 1 then leads into part 2. So I think we should use this point in the essay to make clear just how that is going to happen. I'll show you an example of an introduction later and how you can describe this. For now though, I'd like to look at the more difficult part, which is how to actually describe these processes. So what do we do? In a process diagram, normally you're going to look and you're going to write things like number 1, you're going to describe step 1, then you're going to describe step 2, step 3 until the finish. This is a little different because, as you know, we have part 1 and part 2, but we can still break it down into steps. So what happens first here? Well, we look up to the beginning, and I think it's clear that we work our way from here down to the bottom. So we look at the ingredients. We've got limestone and clay and a crusher. So what is happening? The limestone and the clay are turning into powder. So we need to describe this step first, so the crusher. Next, I think we can go to the mixer, then we can go to the heater, then we can go to the grinder, and finally we go to the bags at the end. So you could say there are 5 steps in this first part. But how do we describe them? That's where you're going to need to use your language skills. When we write about process diagrams for IELTS writing task 1, we should use the passive voice. The passive voice puts the emphasis on the physical things because we do not know who is doing them. In a traditional sense, in the active voice, you might say, for example, to look at number 1, some people are crushing limestone and clay. Well, are there any people here? No, I don't see any people. Is there a man or a woman standing there? Is there an operator? We don't know. So instead of using the people and the active voice, we can use the passive voice just to put the emphasis on the process and the things that are here. When we use the passive voice then, we're going to have to find an appropriate verb. And this is something a lot of students really struggle with. But actually, it's not so hard. For the process diagrams that you'll see, often you can turn the noun into a verb. So if we look here, we can see crusher can simply become crush. Mixer can become mix. Heater can become heat. Grinder can become grind. And bags, that can also be a verb, to bag. So we've got our verbs here that we need to use. So then we want to give some more information. We want to actually state what's happening. So let's look then at the top here. So what is going on? So we can focus on the things, these objects. You can say limestone and clay are, and then we have to put it into the correct form, which is in the past, are crushed into powder. So this is a good example of the passive voice here. Who is crushing them? We don't know. It doesn't matter. So we're taking what would normally be the object of the sentence, we're making it into the subject. We've then got our passive form verb, are crushed, and then we can give a little extra information about what they're crushed into, and that is powder. You can then move over to the next part, mix. In this case, you don't necessarily want to repeat, so you could say the powder is mixed, but it might be better here to say it is mixed. In this case, we avoid repetition. You can see the next stage. Here we have the heater, the rotating heater. There are different ways that we could describe this. You could then say, again, it, or we could go back and say the powder. I think it's useful if we've already said it, we can go back and say the powder again. Or it's possible sometimes you can use this mix as a noun as well. But let's stick with powder. You can say the powder is heated in a rotating heater. So this time we'll actually just copy the phrase rotating heater from here. By the way, you'll notice these are simple, short sentences. In the real essay, you're going to want to link these sentences together. You might make them into one longer sentence, for example. I'm just giving you some basic examples. What about grind? This is an irregular verb, a little harder to use. You can go back to it. It is then ground into cement. So here we've got is ground. That's our passive voice. But we've got this adverb then in here to show time. And I would definitely join these two sentences together and say before being bagged. So I would not start a new sentence like this. This would be a sentence fragment. So I would definitely make these into one sentence before being bagged. Right, so that's part one. Part two is a bit simpler, really, because you have all these different components getting put together into a concrete mixer. we're going to pretty much use the same language form here. There we go. And so you can talk about the percentages or proportions of these things, and you can say the components, or you can use ingredients, although it's arguable that ingredients can only really refer to food, but I've heard it referred to other things. The components are mixed together in a concrete mixer. So again, we're utilizing our passive voice here, as in are mixed. So in terms of grammar, we're basically just using the passive voice. In terms of vocabulary, you're pretty much copying from the material. You don't need to create any new nouns or verbs. You pretty much adapt them. So crusher, crush, mixer, mix, heater, heat, and so on. If you want, you can add your own vocabulary. That's not a bad thing to do. Just be careful that you choose an appropriate word. Let's look at my sample answer now. We can see here. So I've introduced this very simply. There are two diagrams showing industrial processes. What does this mean? Well, industrial processes, basically processes relating to industry. You can assume that these are going to be taking place in a factory or a building site, something like that. The first shows the production of cement, while the second shows the production of concrete. So, of course, that goes back to what I was indicating here. We have these two parts, part 1, part 2. It is apparent from the beginning of the second picture, that's up here, that cement is used in the production of concrete, and so these images are linked as part of one longer process to make concrete from a number of different materials. So, this sentence is quite long. It's a very useful sentence that guides the reader through our thought process, and importantly, it links these two diagrams together. So 1, we make cement, and 2, we're making something by using cement. Okay, so our first paragraph then, we're going to look at cement production. In the diagram showing cement production, limestone and clay are tipped into a crusher. So you'll notice a new word here that I did not mention previously. So tip means to put something in. It means to take a container of something and to put it into another thing. So it is a useful word. Are tipped into a crusher until they become powder. In this case, you can see I have chosen not to use crushed. I've decided that's self-evident, and I've chosen to use a new verb instead. But to say crushed is fine. The powder is then fed into a mixer and then later into a rotating heater. The resulting material is ground into cement, which is then bagged in large sacks. So you'll notice again, I used fed. This comes from feed, which means to put something into something else. Now, not just anything. You can feed a person, you could feed a dog because they eat the thing that you give them. But you can also feed a machine. We think of machines as eating the things that we put into them. So instead of using mix and heat, which I thought were maybe a little too basic, I've decided to use fed, which I think is a little more creative. Again, there's nothing wrong with saying are mixed, are heated, is mixed, is heated. But I've chosen to add some more interesting vocabulary here. You notice I did use bagged and ground here. And instead of saying bags, I changed this word to sacks, which basically means a large bag that you might keep something like cement inside. Next, the final paragraph relates to this second diagram. These bags of cement are poured into a concrete mixer with water, gravel, this should say, and sand. I mixed out that word. This mixture must be carefully measured according to the percentages on the diagram. Now, did I repeat the percentages? No, I did not. I don't think that's really necessary. As long as your language indicates why you're not repeating them or indicates something else that is appropriate to say, you don't need to be writing down all these numbers. It's a waste of time and it doesn't look good. Finally, the concrete mixer will combine the ingredients by rotating in order to produce concrete. Did I say mix? No, I said combine. It has the same meaning as mix. So you can see here how I've upgraded my vocabulary with a few interesting words like these three: tipped, fed, and combine. However, I have also used the words indicated previously, like ground and bagged. Oh yeah, and I added the word poured. So when I see all this happening here, this means to pour is another way of saying like tipped, as in to put one thing into another container. So this answer here, this would definitely get a band 9. It thoroughly describes the diagram. It uses language appropriately. It is all very formal. There's no real repetition. And everything is described and linked from start to finish. I hope this lesson has been useful for you. If you have any questions about process diagrams, leave them below in the comments section, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. I'll see you again next time for another IELTS tutorial.